Hello, welcome to EVN Report. My name is Maria Titizian, and joining me today is Dr. Nerses Kopalyan, the author of EVN Security Report, joining us from Las Vegas, Nevada. Welcome to the program, Nerses.
Always great to be here.
We're going to be examining the context as we do each month with your security briefings. And the July 2024 report was titled America's Defense Diplomacy, Understanding Washington's Investment in Armenia's Security Architecture. As always, a very interesting and thought-provoking briefing. And you talk about the increasing role that the United States is playing and engaging with in Armenia's emerging security architecture. Now, there's been a lot of conversations and discussions taking place in Armenia, and not only about the reasons behind this. And in the briefing, you introduced this concept of defense diplomacy to, first of all, better understand the strategic framework guiding America's engagement with Armenia's security landscape, and secondly, developing the conceptual basis upon which the American approach can be aligned with policy thinking within Armenia. So, to get this conversation going, first of all, let's define what defense diplomacy is and how can this approach be aligned with policy thinking in Yerevan.
Of course. So the concept of defense diplomacy is relatively new when we look at sort of the broader approach that the United States has had in using its military to maintain its hegemonic status throughout the world. And by new, we're basically talking about its more surgical use after the fall of the Soviet Union, when the United States used defense diplomacy to help reform, redevelop, and completely alter the security architecture of the former Warsaw Pact countries, which is basically Eastern Europe. And so we understood then, while the United States had the Marshall Plan with Europe after World War II, this mostly revolved around economic assistance and economic rebuilding, right? There was a military component to it, but it was not specifically military. It is not what we qualify as a military diplomacy. So in the post-Cold War period, we saw the United States military becoming an instrument of American diplomatic initiatives. And so the concept of defense diplomacy was kind of coined in the early 1990s to explain this new form of activity that the American military, which is a traditional hard power construct, is actually engaging in soft power activities. Basically, they're engaging in all these activities that do not entail offensive operations or military operations, but rather statecraft reforms, assisting in democratic governance of the military, civilian oversight, things of that sort. So, with that background, a conceptual definition of defense diplomacy was developed, which basically means that when a powerful country uses its military in a non-violent way, and it does this through numerous bilateral and multilateral activities to advance that country's international and diplomatic objectives. So when we look at what this looks like, right, we're basically talking about the use of military capabilities and resources to achieve the foreign policy objectives of a country through nonviolent means. And so when we look at and some of the elements and characteristics I noted, right, when we look at the components of defense diplomacy, these includes things like helping a given country build institutional trust for its military, or allow this country to enhance, reform, and develop the armed forces that is not only aligned with modern warfare, but also rearticulating that country's security architecture. We see a lot of work on the institutionalization of civilian oversight, which is very important to the American model. And America's understanding is that countries that develop these types of militaries also allows them to have healthy civilian military relationship. Transfer of military science and education, a big part of military diplomacy. And of course, in the broader scheme of things, right, expanding soft power. So every country that the United States has utilized defense diplomacy with, which tends to be almost all of its allies, and also selectively other countries that have very close relations with the United States, there's a model in how this is done. Why is this important, and why did I introduce this in a conversation with respect to Armenian security architecture? As you noted at the start, there's a lot of sort of innuendo, speculation, borderline conspiratorial thinking, and an inability to understand what the United States is doing in Armenia. And that's understandable because we don't have advanced security studies in Armenia, and most individuals that try to talk about this really don't have advanced training in this stuff. But the point of me introducing defense diplomacy in this month's security report was to make the point that Armenia is not unique in this. That the United States uses defense diplomacy extensively, so there is no ulterior motive. There is no this sort of specific targeting of Armenia. There's nothing profound or different in what the United States is doing with Armenia. And as I'm sure we'll discuss more in today's podcast, there's actually a model to how this is done, right? So, in that context, if we want to have a healthy understanding, an objective, a real understanding of what's going on, the assessment is that utilizing defense diplomacy as a framework allows us to better understand what the United States is trying to do in Armenia and whether and to what extent this aligns with Armenia's interests as well.
But what is the United States wanting to do in Armenia? I understand that they do this with all of their allies, but they don't do it because they necessarily like us. They have their own interests and objectives in the region.
Absolutely. And as I noted, defense diplomacy is the utilization of the military to advance a given country's foreign policy objectives, right? But just because a country has given foreign policy objectives, it does not mean that your country's foreign policy objectives or domestic objectives are not taken into consideration. This is why we don't talk about hard power, we talk about soft power, okay? So with Russia, for example, if Armenia's interests don't align with Russia, Russia revolves their approaches to revolve around coercive diplomacy and threats. Okay, America's defense diplomacy doesn't do that. Okay, what it does is it gives you a lot of carrots. Okay, it gives you a lot of carrots, and if you want these carrots, use them. If you don't want these carrots, that's fine. It's your loss. And every country understands, especially a country like Armenia, understands that it is in its strategic interest to utilize those carrots because they're going to strengthen you and enhance your security architecture. The United States isn't forcing Armenia to accept defense diplomacy. The United States isn't forcing any country to accept this defense diplomacy. It's the opposite. Most countries are basically asking the United States to apply its resources and capabilities to enhance the given country's security architecture. So the understanding that there cannot be an alignment of interest and that every country's foreign policy objectives are driven by this zero sum logic is really a post Soviet legacy that's really not consistent with the realities of international relations. So, having that perspective, introducing that paradigmatic approach, allows us to better understand. Because in Armenia, right, a lot of the foreign policy thinking, not so much in foreign policy making, but in the public discourse and sort of in the main punditry, is that always be suspicious with the motives and ulterior objectives of other countries. Of course, but if your approach, if your rationale is driven by pure suspicion and an inability to understand the granular, nuanced policy-making components and structures of the given country at hand, then you're simply not understanding what's going on, and you become stuck in this vicious cycle of suspicion and misunderstanding. So, to answer your question, of course, the United States has objectives. But the next question is, do America's objectives align with the objectives of Armenia? If they don't, and Armenia is being forced to do something, then we could have this conversation. But really, there's no evidence of that. And it's been the opposite, right? It's mostly small states like Armenia who find themselves in a precarious security situation that actually benefit from defense diplomacy. And the example of the post-Warsaw Pact countries is a case in point. An example of Taiwan is a case in point, etc., etc. So we see then that defense diplomacy allows targeted countries to enhance and strengthen their security architecture while at the same time developing stronger diplomatic relations with the United States.
Okay, I do want to come back to that, but before we do, because you mentioned Russia and hard power, you also write that there's an observable and clear difference between Russia's use of military statecraft, what it understands in terms of hard power, and that of the United States. Now, given the differences between Russia's hard power approach and the United States defense diplomacy in Armenia, how has in this case, Armenia's pivot, Western pivot, contributed to the structural basis of the US's defense diplomacy, and what impact has this had on Armenia Russia relations?
Well, okay, so great question. There are three tiers to that question. Note that the United States, for example, tacitly started defense diplomacy not just with Armenia, but in the South Caucasus with the whole NATO partnership program, exchange of basic cadets or military officers, like the Kansas training that we have with the National Guard. Obviously, Georgia has much more deeper and advanced defense diplomacy initiatives with the United States, and Azerbaijan also has had them as well, right? So, United States at some level utilizes its military as an instrument, as I noted, of diplomacy. But the depth and scope changes when the United States considers a country to be an ally or being close to having the designation of an ally. So right now, Armenia has a strategic partnership agreement with the United States. So Armenia's status within the sort of the hierarchy of relevance and the hierarchy of importance in defense diplomacy for the U.S. is a lot different now than it was 2 years ago and a few years ago. And defense diplomacy isn't something entirely new in our region, but the scope and depth of the U.S. engagement with Armenia is. And this happened because of the pivot that we talk about, right? So the United States understood that it is now ready to apply more of its military resources and capabilities in enhancing Armenia's security architecture because Armenia's security architecture no longer is defined by its dependency structure on Russia. And as such, right, if Armenia's now objective, Armenia's interest is to have security independence, America's defense diplomacy offers that to Armenia. Thus, there's an alignment of interest. If Armenia no longer had access to the international weapons market because it was stuck in the CSTO structure that disallowed Armenia access to advanced weaponry from the West, U.S. defense diplomacy opened windows and allowed Armenia, by virtue of its pivot, to have access to these markets, right? And in the report, we also talk about, for example, how the United States and France are working together to enhance Armenia's security architecture. So we see that there's a broader Euro-Atlantic partnership in supporting these initiatives. So what this does is this allows us to understand that there is a mutual adjustment of interest and not a unilateral imposition, which happens to be the case with Russia. But that is not the case with the US or the Euro Atlantic engagement. So, between Armenia's policy reorientation and alignment of Armenia's interests with the Euro Atlantic partnership, we could see how defense diplomacy is strengthening and supporting the interests of Armenia, which is basically security diversification that is to be achieved through security independence. Now, what has this done to our relationship with Russia? Well, of course, there has been a rupture, right? Because Russia's overarching approach is more defined by establishing dominance and then reducing a partner country to one of subservience. So Russia doesn't engage in defense diplomacy. Russia engages in hard power approaches where there aren't so many carrots; it's mostly sticks. That if you don't know what we don't do what we expect you to do, if you don't do what we want to do, there will be punitive consequences. That's how Russia operates, right? And so, in that context, Russia does not approach its relationship with Armenia or any of its other partners in the CSTO through the lens of enhancing that country's security architecture or allowing that country to develop security independence. That contradicts Russia's approach in strategic thinking. Russia's approach is the opposite, to create more dependency on Russia as opposed to allow for security independence. And therefore, its objective is that to have sort of these cluster of countries that have dependence on Russia, and this dependency strengthens Russia's ability to use its stick when it has complications with the given country at hand. So I think those dynamics are very, very important. So conceptually, whereas United States or the Euro-Atlantic partnership is allowing Armenia to develop its military via reforms, military education, exchange of programs, etc., etc. Russia's approach was very different, right? Russia's approach was we would send our officers to Moscow, to Russia for training. We would send our generals to Russia, to Moscow for training. So it was basically a robust structure that Russified political, political, yes, but more military thinking and doctrinal thinking with respect to defense and security. And that obviously has a political component, but that's not what we're talking about. Uh, Defense diplomacy from the West, from the US, does not do that. They're more concerned about strengthening Armenia's military academies, supporting Armenia's ability to establish its security independence, right? Armenia to be able to address its problems, because from US's perspective, or from the Euro-Atlantic perspective, dependency is not a good thing. It's just another headache, right? So US would rather use defense diplomacy to develop strong partners, as opposed to having weak partners that consistently rely on the U.S. to come and save them. So the approach, the grand strategic approach between the U.S. and Russia are very, very different on these points.
Okay, in the report, you talk about the different types of activities, and you mentioned a number of them at the beginning, from civilian oversight to placement of military civilian personnel, embedded in this case, Armenia's defense ministry. There's also bilateral, multilateral military exercises, and the list is quite long. Now, you've also said, and you mentioned also now, that the Euro-Atlantic Partnership's use of defense diplomacy has been instrumental in supporting the enhancement of Armenia's security architecture. So, right now, we know that the U.S. has both France and the U.S. have their military, if you will, representatives in within Armenia's defense ministry. Can you provide some clear examples of how they have already been able to enhance, or is this a long-term project, if you will?
So most definitely, right? So any defense diplomacy project entails military statecraft, and these are long-term processes. Because when if the objective is to do three things: enhance the security architecture of a given country, that is a time-consuming process. Military reforms are a very time-consuming process, and changing the culture and thinking of a given country's security architecture or security apparatus is also a time-consuming process. So inevitably, right, the United States or the Euro-Atlantic Partnership understands that this is a 5 to 10 year investment at minimum to bring Armenia into the Euro-Atlantic integrative structure with respect to security capabilities and defense capabilities. And this is precisely what we saw in the post-Soviet space, right? Eastern Europe's project was a 5 to 10 year project. And so Armenia is rather similar. Of course, the size of the country, the security conundrum that they find themselves in, the level of underdevelopment are also contributing factors. But overarching, this is what we're talking about. Now, to more specific question you pose, the type of activities, right, that U.S. diplomacy entails, and how is this being aligned or collaborated with other Euro-Atlantic partners? One of the more obvious ones, of course, that we've spoken about is the role of both French defense diplomacy and American defense diplomacy in enhancing Armenia's security capabilities. We know, for example, a few things that we could talk about, because this is open information. United States, for example, is working with France in enhancing Armenia's training of its officer corps. The United States is very actively working in developing Armenia's non-commissioned officers. The United States is very actively working in developing Armenia's mission and command structures, logistics capabilities, logistics systems, the software that comes with it. It's working with Armenia and helping developing its cybersecurity capabilities and operational security capabilities, right? So these are examples that these are not hard power components, but a country that has these capabilities obviously enhances its security architecture. France, on the other hand, right, in alignment with the U.S., has been helping to develop Armenian special forces. But with the U.S., it has worked to transfer military science and education, right? Armenia right now has an exchange program with Saint-Cyr, which is France's most advanced military school, and the Vazgen Sarkisian Military Academy. The United States is also supporting and transferring military science and education. And so when we have officer exchange programs, both with both countries, this is an example of the projects that we're talking about. And of course, both have presence of personnel in Armenia's defense ministry. France has a resident a representative in Armenia's defense ministry. The United States just appointed one. So these individuals are there, right, with their advanced knowledge and expertise in matters of the military to support, advise, and also align and collaborate the reforms project. So what we're seeing then is that both at the bilateral level, U.S. Armenia and U.S. France, but also at the multilateral level, U.S. Armenia France, and in the article we talk about more countries that are involved in this. Greece is involved in this, Cyprus is involved in this, et cetera, right? This is the multilateral structuration that is allowing and supporting Armenia in develop and enhance its capabilities. So capabilities isn't simply hard power capabilities, and we've spoken about this in the past, right? It's also the knowledge, the training, the ability to take hard power and apply it. And this is where the support of the United States or its Euro-Atlantic partners come into the play. And these cannot happen if you do not have defense diplomacy. And so the role of defense diplomacy then, right, we're seeing is paying dividends in offering Armenia all of these resources to enhance its security architecture.
Nerses, Armenia has been walking a very delicate line with its relationship with Moscow versus its relationship with the West. And it's been trying to find a balance, if you will, politically and or in its foreign policy directions. Is it possible to do that for security, for defense, for the military? In other words, if Armenia's pivot to the West means greater US or Euro Atlantic engagement with Armenia, whether that is hard power or defense diplomacy, is it possible? Because right now, as we know, there's a legacy of Russian influence and Russian military training, Russian military thinking in Armenia's armed forces at the top levels, at the top brass. How is the military balancing this act?
This is a similar problem that the post-Warsaw Pact countries had as well, and this is where the expertise of the Americans comes into the picture, and also of the French as well. So, like I said, this isn't the first time that this is being done, and Armenia is not an exceptional case. And so, in that context, right, there is a model, and these types of activities that we spoke about that defensive diplomacy entails, and there's a lot of literature and scholarship on this, shows that if you keep the track, right, it develops the least outcomes that you need. So, for example, yes, indeed, you do have, for example, an entire upper brass that was trained in the Soviet Russian legacy and thinking. But once you have officer exchange programs, once you basically develop your military schools that are aligned with modern military schools, once you have NCO training, mission and command training, what happens is the officer class that's going to be taking over from those that have been around for too long, this new cadre of the military leaders are obviously not going to be coming from the school, military school that has failed you, but are going to be coming from military school that has proven to be quite resourceful and successful. And so what Poland went through, for example, is not very different what Armenia is going through. Okay, what Czechia went through, what Slovakia went through, etc., etc. So then, what you're talking about here is in essence a 5 to 10 year process. There is no silver bullet, but if you have military personnel, a new generation of leaders and generals who do have the modality of training needed, okay, to produce the results that are needed, then you're going to attain what you're going to attain. The problem in the past is that we did not have access to that type of training. We did not have those types of programs. So the resources that we needed to be able to do what we're doing right now did not exist in the past. In that context, de-Sovietizing, de-Russifying Armenia's military institutions is being done through defense diplomacy, and that is a time consuming process. But at the same time, like I noted, we have large sets of case studies that showed it does work. With respect to the balance that you're talking about, these are two different phenomenons. Armenia's security decoupling from Russia and transitioning to a Euro Atlantic model isn't a political decision. It was a decision of necessity and a dire security environment that Armenia found itself in. Russia categorically abandoned Armenia and basically abdicated all of its security obligations. And so Armenia had no other option but to pivot. And that pivot entailed, right, engaging in defense diplomacy. Whether Russia is happy with this or not is besides the point, because acquiescing to Russian happiness but being subjugated to continuous Azerbaijani dominance isn't really a solution. So, in that context, this whole fear mongering logic that prevails in some of the security thinking or in the punditry class in Armenia really is inconsistent with reality. Is there a threat from Russia? Of course there is, but that threat has always existed. Okay? Now, would Armenia be able to mitigate those threats prior to the pivot, where he had no resources and capabilities and pure dependency? Or after that, where he could develop his capacity, his resiliency, and his new security architecture, and then find a way of working with Russia? This is a question of ascertaining sufficient capabilities that gives you the ability to address your problems and advance your interests, as opposed to simply saying, you know what? The risks may be too high, so we're not going to do anything, and therefore we're going to acquiesce and keep ourselves in a security structure that has categorically failed. So the logic really doesn't hold. Okay, the logic doesn't hold, and the argument that I'm making is that understanding the Russia threat, finding ways to work with it, is very different than simply saying Russia's always going to be a problem, therefore we shouldn't do anything to upset them. Armenia's objective isn't to upset Russia. Armenia's objective is to solve its security dilemma. Now, if that ends up upsetting Russia, that is a different problem. And of course, Armenia needs to find mechanisms to address those. But security decoupling also does not mean that Armenia has a total break from Russia. We see that economic relations continue, cultural relations continue, energy relations continue. So this isn't some kind of an act where Armenia is basically engaging in this emotional, visceral reaction against Russia's failures. No, these are pragmatic, acute developments that Armenia is engaging in because it had no other alternative.
But there says, I'm going to push back on this issue. If Armenia continues to be dependent on Russia for its energy, economy, I don't know, infrastructure, how is it possible to take one very, very critical branch of your country's, in this case, the military or security architecture, and decouple while you are still engaged heavily in other branches?
That's an excellent question, and I get those questions from the Europeans a lot. I used to get those questions from Americans, but not anymore because now most understand two things. One, Armenia's economic dependence in Russia is intrinsically exaggerated, meaning that it's not a unilateral, one sided dependency. There's a reciprocal component here, that Russia also has a certain level of dependency on Armenia as well, whether it's the sanctions regime that Russia is subjugated to by virtue of the Ukraine war, and the fact that Armenia is part of the Eurasian Economic Union and it plays an instrumental role in initiating and being a conduit for trade. So the exaggeration that Russia would cut all economic ties with Armenia is really contradictory to Russian interests
But
as
that's not what
well.
I'm saying.
So now,
Sorry to interrupt. I'm not saying that it's going to cut
right,
economic ties. Armenia's largest trading partner is Russia.
of course, because structurally that has been the case for 30 years. But now what you're doing is you're going from security diversification to now you're attempting to go through to economic diversification. Well, the point is that you're never going to cut economic ties with Russia, and why would you? But being fully dependent on Russia is unhealthy. So if you look at Armenia's economic structure, right? Armenia has a very fast growing IT sector, right? It's service sector, which makes up close to, roughly speaking, about 17-18% of its economy. That's not Russia dependent. It's tourism sector, which makes about 14-15% of its economy. It's not Russia dependent, right? So now that you go to the other sectors such as mining, agriculture, et cetera, and those do have dependency. Okay. But then at the same time, right, you're seeing Armenia working with its Euro-Atlantic partners to open new markets because you can't find markets overnight. So what we're seeing is a transitional phase. And so while there is deep engagement with Russia that some may perceive as dependency, I view it as a structural reciprocity. Okay. Can Russia hurt Armenia economically? Of course it can, but it would also hurt itself. So it would be against Russia's strategic interest to cut economic ties with Armenia. So to use that fear factor as an argument to deny Armenia's track towards security independence simply doesn't hold. You could still have healthy economic relations with Russia, but at the same time, right, have security diversification. And same thing with energy. Energy is the one thing that right now Armenia is the most dependent on with Russia, and that is by design, right? We know very well that in the in the early 2000s, the Kocharian administration sold everything that Armenia had to the Russians. And further, in the mid 2000s, when Armenia had the opportunity to develop new oil pipeline gas lines with Iran, the Russians basically sabotaged it because the objective was to maintain a dependency structure. But what we're seeing few
But
things
the
right now.
Americans also prevented that as well, did they not?
Right, and that was a political decision and not an economic decision
Which
because
had an impact
by
on our energy
by disrupting
transportation.
right by disrupting Armenia's access to Iranian oil, Armenia was not dependent on America at that point for anything, but it enhanced Armenia's dependency on Russia. And I agree that was a very short-sighted move by the Bush administration. But then the Bush administration was what the Bush administration was. But when we look at the long-term trajectory right now, what are we seeing? Armenia is attempting, right, and there's a very, very strong move towards this to establish energy independence as well. The fact that the United States right now is talking about developing small modular thing reactors in Armenia is a serious subject of conversation, right? The fact that we have so much investment in solar energy and sustainable energy, et cetera, again, these are mechanisms of diversification. They're not going to happen overnight. But if we're talking about alternative markets for Armenia's economy and the diversification of Armenia's economy. And we're talking about the diversification of Armenia's energy sector. And we also became with the diversification of our Armenia's security architecture. What are we talking about here? We're talking about diversification in each of these areas that could allow for independence in each of those areas. So, within that context, this is not an anti-Russian move. This is Armenia saying, "I am a sovereign country." Instead of being consistently dependent on others, I have to develop the skills of being dependent on myself. And so, the argument that seeking independence in energy, in economy, in security is somehow an anti-Russian move is really incoherent and an intellectually dishonest conversation.
Just for the record, I did not say it's an anti-Russian move. My question was, can you
Right.
diversify or decouple in your security while being heavily dependent on Russia for your energy
I agree,
and
but
your economy?
that presupposes that it'll upset Russia as a anti-Russian move,
It's not
and of
about
course
upsetting Russia. It's
disrupt the
about the
pivot.
possibility of functioning as a state.
Absolutely, of course there is. Of course there's a very robust possibility because Russia right now, and we've spoken about this extensively. The entirety of Russia's resources are at the Ukrainian front. In that context, there's a window of opportunity for Armenia to exit Russia's dependency structure. Again, not break relations with Russia, but exit the dependency structure, establish some level of independence. So then when you restructure relations with Russia, it'd be very different. Listen, when you look at Azerbaijan, right, Azerbaijan has very little dependency on Russia because it did not fall into Russia's dependency structure. Same with Georgia. Yes, Georgia received immense support from the West, right? And even with all these developments that we're seeing in Georgia, Georgia has no dependency on Russia. They have working relations, they have engagements, but the dependency entails that if a given actor turns off the valve, you will either starve or you would die because you're dependent on them. Azerbaijan doesn't have that. Georgia doesn't have that. Armenia for 30 years had that. So escaping that level of severity doesn't mean you're trying to destroy relations with Russia. It simply means you're going towards foreign and security policy independence.
Okay, I always try to keep these podcasts short. It never works. So I do want to try to wrap it up a bit if we can. Okay, so the United States has been employing defense diplomacy. It has initiated programs to, some of the activities. This includes bilateral contacts between senior military and civilian officials, training of personnel, provision of expertise, and the appointment of personnel. And just to make it clear, it's not about hard power here. America is not supplying Armenia with arms, as far as we
Not yet.
know. No, not yet. Okay. And the Eagle Partnership Exercise, this is the second by a joint military exercise that took place in Armenia with service members from the United States Armed Forces and Armenia's Armed Forces. Based on all of these, or noting these developments, what more can Armenia expect from America's defense diplomacy? And let me, because I always love to do this, say, what can Armenia do wrong to stop this
Right.
this
So
relationship
what
moving
can it
forward.
expect from
Mhm.
the defense diplomacy, right? And we're basically not being speculative here. We're going off of the model of defense diplomacy and the types of activities engaged in. Therefore, we're going off of the existing empirical data on this. So Armenia can expect concrete engagement and contacts at various unit levels between the military. So, for example, right, Armenian units engaging and training with American units, specifically, for example, special forces or medical training or the corps of engineers, etc., etc. So, where you have initially sort of this very broad general engagement, you could have specific tactical engagement at the unit level, which enhances the capabilities of your armed forces. Now, that entails, of course, a certain level of closeness between two militaries to be able to do that. So this is where it's going, and once that relationship is developed, that's something that could be expected from them. Also, while we've seen the United States come and work with Armenia in helping train field hospital management or peacekeeping, we haven't seen more specific special training from the United States. That could happen, right, as defense diplomacy and as this relationship enhances. Because another component or type of activity that you have with defense diplomacy is that the United States deploys special training teams, right, to address specific needs areas of the given country's defense sector. So you may see, for example, special American training forces, right, being brought to Armenia to observe and help Armenia address problems that it has in security architecture. France, for example, has been doing this to some level, right? The United States will also start doing that as well. Another thing to expect is the provision of military equipment. Now, of course, there's been some provisions, whether we're talking about sort of, like military ambulances and field hospital stuff, et cetera, right? Mostly non lethal stuff. But this also transitions and proceeds to lethal aid as well. So while we're not there yet, right, one thing you can expect is that when you look at types of activities that defense diplomacy entails, lethal aid is also part of it. So once you get to that level, the notion that United States will never give hard power capabilities to Armenia is not true, because an important component of defense diplomacy is at a given point when the given country is ready to also give them a hard power capabilities. Armenia has done multilateral military exercises with the United States, as you noted, the Eagle Partner one, elevating this to multilateral exercises, where Armenian units will be integrated with, for example, NATO units or US, France, Greece programs, hypothetically in the future, that may be developed to develop multilateral exercises as well. Also at different forms, with aerial defense exercises, et cetera, anti-aircraft, so on and so forth. So these are things to be expected. And finally, the forming of some kind of a bilateral defense agreement. This isn't sort of, an agreement where the United States will come and save you if you're attacked. Nothing like that, right? But defense agreements are important because, one, they're legally binding. Two, the given country now invests in your security because they have a defense agreement with you. And three, symbolically, it's extremely important. So, a final byproduct of years of defense diplomacy can be the signing of a bilateral defense agreement between the given countries. So these are some things that Armenia can expect and should expect if we continue down the track. Now, what can happen or what could Armenia do, right, potentially to screw these things up? And there are a few obvious examples. One, if you have, for example, a rebirth or a latent tendency of corruption in the military apparatus, where these programs do not work, or the United States realizes that by investing in this, things are being siphoned off, that you don't have quality officers, that this basically the entire endeavor is not working. So corruption and incompetence on Armenia's behalf, malicious incompetence, can obstruct and create problems. Another, of course, can be political, right? If, for example, Armenia's government makes strategic errors in the appointment of certain personnel in important positions in the military, and these individuals obstruct or basically create problems for the implementation of the programs that we're talking about or the success of these programs. So things of that sort. But fundamentally, unless Armenia makes egregious errors, okay, unless it makes egregious errors, really, there is nothing that could disrupt the flow of defense diplomacy, because also you have to understand that defense diplomacy is designed in a way to anticipate continuous problems. Because when you're trying to take an underdeveloped military or defense structure and to enhance it and improve it to the level of a developed one, of course that's going to be a slow, tedious, and problematic process. But as long as Armenia doesn't make intentional, egregious mistakes, there's really nothing that's going to disrupt this process.
And what external factors could there be for the US to halt its defense diplomacy? Because clearly it has interests in the South Caucasus, and we all know what those interests are. What could be any external factor, or could, I don't know, a change in the political establishment with the upcoming elections in the United States impact?
Yes, see, there can be external factors to Armenia and sort of, indigenous factors to the United States. Hypothetically, if, for example, due to allocation of funds, a new administration decides that the Department of Defense should limit its defense diplomacy programs, in which case it would be specific, for example, only to allies and be denied to non allies, in which case everything may be scrapped. And that's a hypothetical, right? Is it possible? Yes. Is it probable? No, because US has invested so much in this project. Why destroy a good thing that's working, right? But that's one component. Another might be, for example, that again, hypothetically, the United States decides to completely disinvest in the entire thing, South Caucasus. Again, highly improbable, but it's possible, right? So what you're talking about here in this context is when you see a very large shift in U.S. grand strategy, where it decides to abandon the South Caucasus or the entire post-Soviet space and basically no longer engage in the region, minus something of that magnitude, which again, it is extremely unlikely because it would contradict U.S. global interest. Minus something of that magnitude, these type of programs are not going to be hampered. And when you look at the broader scheme of things, right? America's defense budget is over 850 billion. Okay. So things that they're doing for Armenia with Armenia through defense diplomacy or the defense diplomacy programs themselves are chump change in the broader scheme of things. And so these are viewed as, from the lens of military and a political economy, actually a very resource non-intense but economically viable programs, because you're not investing much, but you're receiving a lot of soft power dividends and loyalty, or at least collegiality, from the given state that you're engaging in.
Well, Nerses, thank you very much for this longer than usual conversation about American defense diplomacy in Armenia. Very interesting. And for all of you listening, I would recommend going to our site. We have a special section where you can find all the security briefings and read this latest one. So thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you very much, as always.